Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents We Are All Armenian, Voices from the Diaspora. Edited by Aram Mrjoian. Narrated by M.W. Cartozian Wilson. Publisher's note. This audiobook contains references to material present in the print and ebook editions of the book. Editor's note. Anthologies, by their very nature, are as defined by their omissions as they are by their inclusions. No matter how comprehensive, an anthology will always be a momentary attempt, stuck in time, as well as limited by space, editorial awareness, and financial constraints. This perhaps sounds cryptic, but as I set out to edit this collection, and with Armenian history in mind, I very much worried about this project's potential pitfalls and shortcomings. Diasporan Armenians cannot be pinned to a number of essays that is any smaller than the total diasporan population, and even that is problematic. Only a brief and glancing representation of each person and community at a singular moment. This is to say, the Armenian diaspora is both hyperlocal and intersectionally global. There is no such thing as a monolithic ethnic identity. To imagine so is harmful, marginalizing, and dangerous. To create a hierarchy or checklist of one's right to their ethnicity is an act of violence. One of the notable themes that arises throughout these essays is the writers not feeling Armenian enough. Many of these contributors share the sense of being pushed out and othered from both inside and outside their communities. Indeed, this is another sensation I had when I signed up to edit these works. I believed then, and still believe now, in my abilities as an editor, but I have never been able to quash the self-damaging notion that I am living behind a facade of an ethnic identity I have little claim to. My name, yes, is Armenian. My heritage, yes, is Armenian. But I don't speak the language. I don't attend the church. I've never spent much time in Armenian communities. I've never traveled back to the land of my ancestors. I am still constantly learning the basics of diasporan Armenian culture, feeling simultaneously distant from and near to this part of who I am. I guess I should not have been surprised, then, to read this same notion expressed more eloquently from many of the writers whose works are included in this collection. The false but unshakable idea that one is not the right kind of Armenian or not Armenian enough is an inherent and inexorable part of the legacy of genocide, displacement, cultural erasure, and ethnic ambiguity. The Armenian diaspora must also grapple with its own prejudices and forms of erasure. While there's no wrong way to be Armenian, it is damaging and hypocritical to demand recognition of one's ethnicity, one's history, and one's oppression without also recognizing the systems in which one is complicit in oppression, as well as the ways one can cause harm and marginalize and erase others. Despite widely unified calls in diasporan Armenian communities for acknowledgement of the Armenian Genocide and continuing injustices, many members within these communities have maintained exclusionary practices, particularly around dating and marriage, and have at times attempted to omit queer, multi-ethnic, and multiracial Armenians from the diaspora. This is another tragic and malicious form of violence. Fear, privilege, and power can all spark exclusionary thinking. I worry that in feeling nationless, some seek other kinds of borders. This collection is intentionally inclusive of work by those who have faced historical marginalization in diasporan Armenian communities. Scout Tufangtian, who traveled the world for her work of photojournalism, There Is Only the Earth, Images from the Armenian Diaspora Project, writes, I had grown up thinking that there was a tiny box you needed to squeeze into to be a good Armenian, a box that I did not fit in. But my travels showed me that there is a place for all of us within this huge Armenian family, whether we are half Armenians, gay Armenians, black Armenians, arty Armenians, atheist Armenians, non-Armenian speaking Armenians, or the good old-fashioned 100% Armenian, AYF, AGBU, belonging, church-going, future engineer Armenians. We are all Armenian. All of us have a role to play in the future of our community. For many diasporan Armenians, home is also a complicated concept, and the binaries of borders present a confounding lack of definition for Armenians around the world. Where does one consider home when home is both everywhere and somewhere else? What happens when one's home is destroyed, contested, stolen, and denied? Diasporan Armenian writers, and particularly Armenian American writers, bear the burden of having to repeat their history over and over because it remains widely forgotten and unacknowledged. For more than a century, Turkey has leveraged geopolitical power, military force, propaganda, and terroristic violence in an attempt to eliminate the undeniable proof of their ongoing wrongdoing. Tragically, this strategy has been effective in obfuscating the history of the Ottoman Empire's genocidal legacy and makes it difficult for Armenians worldwide to find closure or address more recent acts of terror. I have heard Armenians echo the phrase "never again," referring to the massacres that took so many of their ancestors. Those two direct words, in their axiomatic clarity, must extend to all humanity. Our respect for human rights needs to be universal, inclusive, and unflinching. But right now, we must once again shout this phrase as we witness widespread fascism and violent intolerance return in contemporary iterations. In my own personal essays, I've often argued that writers from the Armenian diaspora across genres spanning fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and criticism are weighed down by the incessant need to educate their audience and fight the systemic rewriting and erasing of their history with their words. The Armenian writer is often forced to lay a foundation of knowledge before getting to the story they would like to tell. Working with the writers included in this book has helped me better see the innovative, diverse, and expansive range of narratives and research being produced by diasporan Armenians today. For their trust in me, I will always be grateful. Aram Mrjoian. Introduction. On April 24, 2021, Joe Biden became the first sitting U.S. president to release a statement formally acknowledging the Armenian Genocide. The brief note quickly summarized the well-documented massacres, death marches, deportations, and legacy of displacement, events unfamiliar to many Americans. Concluding, Biden noted, "The American people honor all those Armenians who perished in the genocide that began 106 years ago today." April 24th, the date annually recognized as Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, symbolically marks the beginning of one of the 20th century's largest atrocities: the systemic plunder, torture, and murder of approximately 1.5 million Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire during the years 1915 through 1923. On that date in 1915, hundreds of Armenian intellectuals, artists, activists, and other community leaders were arrested and soon killed. The mass violence and deportations that followed were a calculated, organized, and state-endorsed plan executed under the direction of the Ottoman Empire's highest leadership. Surviving Armenians in the region were displaced, exiled, Islamized, or forced into hiding. At the time, the Armenian Genocide received extensive media coverage. 145 articles appeared in the New York Times in 1915 alone. An editorial in the October 14, 1915 issue of The Nation states, "A series of misdeeds like those in Armenia are the concern of the whole world," and ties this tragedy abroad to the lynching of African Americans. From 1915 to 1929, the Committee on Armenian Atrocities raised more than $116 million in aid. Famously, Teddy Roosevelt refused to join the committee because he instead advocated for war against Turkey and found it hypocritical to solicit permission to help the survivors. After finding support in Congress, President Woodrow Wilson designated October 21 and 22 as days to express sympathy and aid for Armenian and Syrian populations. For Wilson, the call to create the League of Nations was in part catalyzed by the moral demand to help Armenians and other defenseless populations across the globe. Later, Wilson, in poor health, would become responsible for drawing a section of the border for an independent Armenia. However, as the United States shifted to reliance on foreign oil, political sympathies toward the Armenian cause became inconvenient, and for decades afterward, Turkey exerted geopolitical power to silence American politicians. While perhaps unintentionally ambiguous, the wording in the closing sentence of Biden's statement is significant. For more than a century, the Armenian Genocide has been widely contested, denied, and erased, even though there is overwhelming historical documentation and confirmation among historians and academics. Violence against Armenians remains both a concrete and an existential threat today. In 2020, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, made a veiled reference to the ongoing violence and erasure of the Armenian Genocide when he stated, "We will continue to fulfill the mission our grandfathers have carried out for centuries in the Caucasus." Today, Turkey is regularly ranked among the world's top 3 countries for imprisoning journalists, writers, and other artists. The country's current penal code contains wide-ranging articles that prohibit free speech, including Article 301, which, as cited in a 2021 report by PEN America, criminalizes publicly degrading the Turkish nation, state of the Turkish Republic, Turkish Grand National Assembly, the government of the Republic of Turkey, and the judicial bodies of the state. Yet, denial of the Armenian Genocide extends well beyond malicious campaigns to bury the past. On November 9, 2020, while Americans remained enraptured in the presidential election, Azerbaijan successfully achieved a long-desired land grab in the independent ethnically Armenian Republic of Artsakh, known more widely as Nagorno-Karabakh. After 6 weeks of horrific warfare, during which Armenians were terrified that full-scale ethnic cleansing was imminent, Russia brokered a vague treaty that proved beneficial for every party except Armenians. During the war, thousands of Armenian soldiers and civilians were killed. Over 100,000 have been permanently displaced. As Azerbaijan repopulates seized areas of the region, countless Armenian religious sites dating back to early Christianity are at risk of destruction. This was not without warning. In late October of the same year, well before the ceasefire, dozens of genocide scholars had signed a statement drawing attention to the Nagorno-Karabakh situation, which included the following: current political statements, economic policies, sentiments of the societies, and military actions by the Azerbaijani and Turkish leadership should warn us that genocide of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh and perhaps even Armenia is a very real possibility. Unrelated to this specific statement, the Armenian genocide literature scholar Dr. Rubina Perumian notes in her extensive literary research how forceful and profound is the impact of Turkish denial, such that the pain does not subside, even when myriad genocide scholars, historians, and government officials around the world make sympathetic remarks in recognition of the Armenian genocide. Today, there are an estimated 11 million Armenians living around the world, but fewer than 3 million living within the country of Armenia. However, much of the Armenian diaspora remains extremely vocal and active about their distant homeland. For many, acknowledgement and reparations from Turkey remain central to breaking the cycle of intergenerational trauma. Storytelling and activism have also always been important aspects of Armenian culture, since long before countless writers and artists were murdered under Ottoman rule. For recent generations of diasporan Armenian writers, Telling their stories often requires a complex balance of contextualizing the past and reporting on the present, respecting a culture that has been shattered and glued back together across the globe, while feeling lost in its cracks and forgotten remnants. Diasporan Armenian writers, particularly in their fiction and creative nonfiction, thus have found esoteric ways of experimenting with form, style, and narrative structure to tell hybrid stories. In the print and ebook versions of this collection, you'll find a helpful but far from comprehensive list of Armenian and diasporan Armenian literature that spans genres and offers wider insights into Armenian religion, literature, history, and culture. Of course, the essays included here provide personal perspectives on these themes as well. I hope the included selections fill you with light and outrage, joy and concern, and an equal demand for self-reflection and urgent action. How Armenian Funeral Halva Helped My Family Find Home in America. Liana Agajanian. There was only one thing I understood about death as a child. When it arrived, it brought with it halva. Halva, which means sweetmeat in Arabic, is a confectionery made with assorted ingredients like tahini, sesame paste, or semolina, and eaten in various forms across the world, from the Middle East to the Balkans to India. It's even sold commercially in the United States. The recipe I knew, however, involved 4 key things: sugar, butter, flour, and funerals. At the funerals I attended as a child, wading through a sea of black outfits with the distinct smell of frankincense in my nose, I'd search through the crowd for my aunts and the glistening, aluminum foil-wrapped treasure they carried on a tray. Multiple days of mourning, house visits, and marathon funeral services administered by the Armenian Apostolic Church. This was the price I had to pay for a tiny piece of halva. It would disappear as quickly as it would materialize, giving me mere seconds of joy in the midst of grief. I can't remember when I first had funeral halva, a tradition practiced by Armenians as well as other communities including Iranians, Assyrians, Turks, and Greeks. But I know I never forgot what it tasted like. Equal parts grainy and sweet, a little nutty. I loved the simplicity of it, how such intensity could be created by stirring together 3 ingredients that only partially formed other recipes. I always had trouble taking just one piece. I was born in Tehran to an Armenian family whose roots carry the complicated combination of a centuries-old legacy in the country now known as Iran and a history of genocide, exile, and migration. We came to the United States as refugees at the tail end of the Iran-Iraq War, and like many Iranian and Armenian immigrants thrust into a world thousands of miles from the one they knew, we tried to recreate home in Southern California. I quickly learned that life inside my house, where my name was pronounced the way it was intended to be, where I ate stuffed grape leaves instead of peanut butter and grape jelly sandwiches, and where my parents watched public access programming in Armenian and Farsi instead of the Super Bowl, was different from life elsewhere. Dealing with this contrast as a child often overwhelmed and confused me. Back then, my 2 identities didn't blend together as easily as they do now. Their melding was a slow, simmering process that required patience. Eventually, working to establish ourselves in the new country, we had stayed long enough to begin burying family, friends, and acquaintances. Funerals formed the backbone of my childhood, the same way weddings did. They were big, expensive, elaborate events full of many people I knew, and many I did not. I accompanied my parents to Armenian churches scattered across Los Angeles and to cemeteries that held both the immigrants that built LA and the Hollywood stars that made the city famous. I went to wakes where distant relatives spoke quietly under their breath and gulped down endless piping hot chai from a samovar. I attended drawn-out church services, listening to excruciatingly somber, yet beautiful Armenian hymns and the booming voice of the priest that bounced off the walls as he read from the Bible. The graveside service was the home stretch. I gripped the grass with my shoes on the hills where we stood, and I hoped I could hold on until the end. As the casket was lowered into the ground, the frankincense glowed in the brass burner, emitting clouds of smoke that acted as a pathway between mortal prayers and God. After requiem services, we would get in our cars once more and drive to a special lunch called the Hoke Josh, which means soul meal, a memorial meal for the deceased. Stemming from an age-old tradition in which food was made and distributed to the poor after a death, the Hoke Josh evolved into a service held at home or a nearby restaurant hosted by bereaved family members. For my family, that meant heading up to the banquet-style second floor of an Iranian Armenian restaurant where we dined on what we always did, whether there was a funeral or not. A table covered from end to end in various dishes and appetizers, like kubide, an Iranian kebab made from beef, saffron-stained rice, and a shallot yogurt dip called mast o mosir, among copious amounts of lavash bread, butter, and sumac. When I couldn't, or didn't want to, attend these funerals, I'd request halva to be brought back home. "Can you sneak a piece, or maybe two?" I'd ask my parents as they stood in the doorway, heading to the cemetery. Recapturing the taste of halva in the New World became a personal mission of mine. It must have been significant that my dad began making this funeral food at home for us, where everyone was very much alive. My sister and I would crave it spontaneously, the memory of its taste hitting us when we lingered too long at the dinner table, filling the silent space with reminiscences about when we had last seen our extended family. We'd wait and watch, witnessing my dad practice his art in a different way. In the making of halva here in America, his skills as an artist came to use, remnants of a life and career he had largely left behind when the war took him from his home and made him a refugee. He'd stir the flour in a saucepan until it turned the color of burnt ivory, then add the butter and sugar. Shaping a glob of burnt flour and butter into a tray was no easy task, and neither was using kitchen utensils to carve uniform designs on top. This process bound us to each other at a time when we were unsure of our place in a new, unfamiliar country. Funeral halva was that and more. It was a ritual food, but it also became a marker of my own identity. It made me aware that even in death, the legacy I had to contend with spanned several countries and cultures. It was a tradition practiced for millennia, imported and kept alive in diasporic communities that helped define who we were. It was a little piece of sweetness that always reminded me how complex my history was up until the very end. They say you don't fully become part of a place until you put your dead in the ground. My family has created a home in America. Our traditions have become as much a part of this landscape as our deceased kin have. Though I'll always associate halva with funerals, it's become a bigger symbol of all the people and places I could no longer access. The city I never knew as an adult, the languages I never fully learned, the relatives I never got to see over the years. Growing up, I often felt like I didn't have much to ground me in one place or another, but food, especially halva, became a tangible personification of my roots, the same way it has for so many immigrants and their children. Though much was lost over the years, there was always halva. It helped me explore and connect with a history interrupted by forced migration and political upheaval. It is a sweet intermediary between life and death, a dense fusion made of flour, sugar, and butter. Hava Nagila, Naira Kuzmich. If God wants people to suffer, he sends them too much understanding. Yiddish proverb. Before I tell you about the strange night I danced to Hava Nagila in a bar in Berlin, I have to admit that I think about this night often, and I think about it on two different occasions. I think about it when I find myself at a loss for words, when I am confused about how to feel, what to do or say or think. A new horror on the news, and suddenly I picture myself dancing. A colleague at work proposes a diversity field guide manual, and I smell the spilled cocktails, the heavy breath of the man beside me. People keep tweeting, "Protest is fun," and that famous Hasidic melody spins round and round in my head. The sticky bar floor spins under my feet, too. But I also think about that night when I am most clear-headed, when I feel I have finally grasped something beyond my reach. A moment of enlightenment, perhaps, a moment of profound pleasure. I hold my niece in my arms, swing her to sleep, and it is she who has her hand on my shoulder that night in Berlin. I was 20 years old and traveling through Germany with 2 girlfriends. We had met while we were studying abroad in Ireland, and 2 weeks in Germany after the fall semester ended sounded like a good way to cap off our European adventure, especially after meeting a considerable number of Germans in Ireland who were funny and hospitable, friends who would host us if we came through their towns. We began our trip in Berlin. F was a green-eyed, brown-skinned Indian American born and bred in Southern California, and B was Canadian, pale and short, with Macedonian and Caribbean family roots. And me, at 5 feet 10 and 180 pounds, I was the big, black-haired, black-eyed Armenian American immigrant girl who was finally free of her family, her culture, all those obligations and expectations and traditions that made her desperate, had her saving money and begging her parents for years before they finally agreed to let her leave home. I have to say here, too, that I was mostly happy when I was abroad. Even now, when I look back with a more cynical eye at my youth, embarrassed of my desperation, my rush to embrace the American dream of an endlessly forgotten past, a constant clean slate, I can say that I was happy. And I'm glad. Glad to have felt for a while what so many feel every day. Glad that my shame now does not take away from my happiness then. There was, however, one evening, one moment, one dance that I danced during my time abroad when my shame triumphed and triumphs still. For this I am glad too. Understanding, for me, when it does not come from the sudden surprise of pleasure, comes from anger. When I danced that dance in a bar in Berlin, I felt a momentary happiness, and it is because I felt it for a moment, when I should have felt it for none, that I will feel ashamed forever. I am, however, grateful for this feeling. It is a small burden to suffer, after all, compared to what so many others shoulder. A small burden and a reminder, not only of the heavier prices others have paid for their actions, feelings, and words, but also of those who float in this life light as a feather, thinking that they do no harm, cause no damage, leave no dead in their wake. It is these people I fear, those who do not suffer, those who do not understand. The middle-aged German woman who ran the hostel told us where to go for a night out, the immigrant part of town, Kreuzberg. Young people like the area, she explained. Travelers feel comfortable there, like they could be locals. But please, she advised, keep an eye on your wallets and on each other. Comfort and safety, she knew, were not always the same thing. When we came out of the subway an hour later, the 3 of us looked at each other uneasily. We were 20, 21, 22. We were women. Girls, really. It was not only what we saw, the graffiti, the smell of garbage, the homeless strewn on the streets like decorations. It was that small pedestrian fear coupled with something deeper. For we had come here to party. We had come to drink cheap beer and dance hard and make out with handsome strangers. But we were not like the majority of the North American girls studying abroad in Ireland. That's what we told ourselves. We were not white girls. Girls with diluted ethnicity. We thought they were a different breed. They did not eat Thos halva or homemade pickled cauliflower, did not dance unironically to turbo folk music or curse in multiple languages. When confronted with the foreign abroad, there was always an extra layer for us to work through, because we knew that sometimes we were one of them, the others, but other times we weren't.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?